many others, and they all said that you have the ability to see around corners like no one else. And my question is, how do you create a framework, or how do you allow yourself to continuously see around corners, or put yourself in a position to see the future before other people do?
Yeah, I mean, I think
it's a really hard question.
I think so. Some of it might be sort of a certain aptitude, but I do have, maybe running a company and sort of building the labs team, and we have some amazing people there, have actually forced me to sort of try and distill some of these into methodologies. I think the key elements are, first of all, I think about the world. I try to sort of break things down into first principles, not just I see that X is happening, but rather, why is this happening? Why is whatever DevOps disruptive to security? Like, what are sort of the fundamentals? You break it down, you get down to, well, it predicates around independent teams. Okay, so it's independent teams are kind of at the core of this sort of agile development approach. So how do you do security in agile? So you end up, if you break it down into sort of the core principles, then you can now try to relate them to needs or to where you think has legs to sort of evolve and where not. And so I try to sort of break those down. The other thing that happens when you break it down is that you can grow your thinking. I have this amazing guy leading our labs team at Snyk, Miki, and he's incredible, and he can hold so much complexity in his head. And we had this conversation about how, like, even if you can hold a ton of complexity in your head, it's still limited. Even the best people around it. But when you think about a topic and you reduce it down into these sort of core principles, like you sort of say, okay, DevOps, builds on blamelessness, continuous processes, and independent teams. Now, even you yourself cannot bother yourself with all the sort of the mess that is behind those statements, and you can build on top of that. So you can build bigger and bigger pictures, building on those components. And sure, you'd be able to drill down into one of these tracks a bit more than maybe someone who just hears those principles. But I think it allows you to think bigger if you kind of codify the world that way. I think the other piece that's very important to it, though, is that once you do that, you need to get into the habit of anchoring in the future. And so, for instance, I love to ask, our product managers and sort of, angel investments that I make, this capability you're building, in 5 years' time, would it be more or less necessary in the world? And why? Why do you think that is? And so
just digging in on that, is there a right answer to that? And how do you analyze the different variants of responses?
First, it really starts by asking the question, but it tries to sort of kind of step away a little bit from being stuck with something that is exciting to you to do today, but you're really just plugging a hole versus solving a systemic problem. Sometimes the fact that something will be less relevant in 5 years' time, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means that you should invest appropriately. It might mean that it's okay to put something a bit more tactical about how you address it. It might mean you shouldn't rely on that as your growth vehicle. And when you're founding a company, if the answer to the core value proposition that you have isn't yes, if you can't kind of rationalize why it is more needed in 5 years' time, you should pick a different idea, because you wouldn't be at any sort of scale if you're just starting in 5 years' time. That's when your idea should be most needed.
To what extent do you think you can actually say, and I know that sounds strange, but bluntly, the hardest thing I think about investing in AI today is the speed of evolution. I'm kind of bluntly betting on great people who are directionally right because it's moving so fast. To the extent that you can say 5 years time will be more or less necessary, I mean, who knows?
Yeah, I think it's very hard. AI is especially kind of disruptive at the moment, and I do think that there's, AI as a whole will totally dominate the world. Specifically, there's a certain kind of a honeymoon period happening with GPT and LLMs, which I think will find the right limits to it. I don't really know them. I think typically if you're immersed in a space, if you come from a space and if you sort of have sufficient sort of ability in it, you can kind of roughly get market timing within a plus minus 2 years time horizon. That's kind of my mental model. Now, plus minus 2 years is like life and death for a startup, and so you have to navigate the journey. And I guess again, kind of my system over here is not so much to sort of perfectly line it. I mean, there is a certain, like, you're making a bet. You're sort of saying, I think this is necessary. You've asked the question about whether it'll be more necessary moving forward. You have a thesis about your sort of theory of change and how you would do it. And then I try to apply this sort of big vision, small steps type lenses. And so big vision, and you have to be working towards something that matters at the destination, but it has to be sort of a sequence of steps towards it. And ideally, you don't regret taking any of those steps. If they take longer, if you get stuck in them for a couple of years, you don't regret taking that step. And so you try to figure out the destination, figure, of course, your upcoming step, have a sense of what the next step would be. You don't really know past that, and you get going. And so if you get stuck, you still have something that you've built that is of value, and you continue. And sometimes you find yourself on a different path, and maybe